My name is Corin Walker. I'm a, that was supposed to say senior intern. I'm the senior software architect at Proofgeist. I've been working with FileMaker for, 27, 28 years. I don't know. It seems like a long time. I've actually been developing since I was 5. I frequently got told to leave my classroom as a kindergartner and just go do stuff on the computers. And that was sort of the case pretty much most of the time. And I found FileMaker, interestingly enough, in a number of different ways. I actually found Nutshell first. I was working at a library, and they had a system called Nutshell to manage like their patrons. And I didn't know that that was FileMaker until much later. I went to a play session, and he was like, oh, yeah, here's the history in Nutshell. And I was like, oh, those are the same thing. And then when I actually got into professional FileMaker development, I was working on the networking side. I was doing some Mac networking, and there was another consultant who had built this incredible FileMaker advertising sales system in FileMaker. And he was installing it, and he kind of took me under his wing and showed me everything, and I was kind of hooked. And then my next job in FileMaker was installing a call center reservation system for Holiday Inn. So I was just kind of thrown into it. And I quickly learned that I had no idea what I was doing. But after another 26, 27 years, I've sort of figured things out now. So one of the things that I've been interested in is actually the philosophy of development. So I actually formally have a computer science degree, which is not a computer development degree or software development degree. It's actually about the theoretical portion of computer science. So I had to figure out algorithms. I had to create my own processors and my own compilers and all of that stuff. So I learned a lot of the low-level things. I learned how to program in machine language and assembler and all of that. So whenever I look at anything, even if it's FileMaker, which is a very low-code environment, I'm still seeing some of those fundamentals. And that's the thing that attracts me to development, is seeing where all of these commonalities are and how we can apply some of these abstract systems. A lot of people, when they approach FileMaker development, they think, well, this doesn't really apply to FileMaker because FileMaker is special. FileMaker is different. And with this session, I was like, well, it is, but it isn't. So what do we mean by a DevOps approach? So I think for a lot of people, and part of this, I've been going around and asking people what DevOps is and whether they've heard of it. Most people have heard of it. How many people here have heard of it? So a lot of people. How many people here actually know what it is? You think so? Okay. We'll see. Because in my experience, when I start asking people what DevOps is, or specifically, where is DevOps? Who is DevOps? And why is DevOps? So I've asked this question to many people, and they just look at me confused because they're like, don't you mean what is DevOps? And I think actually these are more appropriate questions when we're talking about DevOps. It's not about what DevOps is. It's about where is it? Where do we do DevOps? Who is doing DevOps? And why are we doing DevOps? So those people who really think that they know what DevOps is, I'm counting on you to tell me that I'm doing it wrong, because I don't know everything, or at least I don't think I know everything. I've just never been wrong. So, but except my wife says I'm always wrong. I've never been right. But when I'm looking at the DevOps approach to FileMaker development, I'm kind of looking at, well, can we do all of DevOps in FileMaker? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe with some tools that are coming soon, I hope. Crossing fingers, and here somebody whispered to Clay my wish list of features here. But right now, this is what I think we can do in terms of DevOps and applying it to FileMaker. So as I mentioned, I've been doing professional software development for nearly 3 decades. And I'm not an OG like some in the community. But what I've seen is a lot of things changing, and things are changing even faster. There's like this acceleration of change. And as that change accelerates, we quickly find ourselves getting behind, getting in over our heads, and needing to figure out ways of managing our projects. And I've seen it all. I've seen how solutions have changed. I've seen the different ideas that have come out here. So I think I want to tackle the why is DevOps. But before we can get into that, we have to talk about the software development lifecycle. And I'm gonna try not to use too many jargony terms, but you kind of can't avoid it when you're talking about software development. So the software development lifecycle is really the whole process from the beginning of software. What's the beginning of software? Anybody know?
A problem.
A problem, right? So the beginning of software is not with your code. It's actually with the intent of what you want to build. And then the end of software is like my software at Holiday Inn. Y2K happened. They were like, wait, what is this doing here? Who approved FileMaker? And kicked it out of there. So that was the end of that lucrative contract. But I got paid all of $10,000, by the way, to develop a call reservation center for Holiday Inn. And they thought that was too much. So really this life cycle, software development life cycle, is the overarching category that we're talking about here. And DevOps is one of the things that fits under that. So in the beginning, this was software. How many people have done punch card systems? Awesome. I did my first punch card system in Fortran. I did my second one when I was interning at Cray Systems just outside of Pueblo, Colorado. That was sort of my big internship. And I was just like completely over my head. They had this giant computer, all liquid cooled. It was like the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. They didn't let me anywhere near that. But this is what we had to do. We had punch cards. You had to make sure they were in order. That's where, don't drop your stack came from. You didn't drop your stack of punch cards because then it was just a nightmare to figure out what order they went in. Also, you hoped that you didn't get bugs, because if you did find a bug, back then, computers were rented. You rented time on the computer. You had a time slot to run your software. If it didn't run in that time slot, too bad. You took your punch stack, you went back to the end of the line and hoped to get another scheduled time on that server. I quickly graduated to doing PDP 11 development and VAX VMS and just kept going on and on from there. But software started out like this. Today, software writes itself. And anybody who's used Cursor knows what this means. This is a mode in Cursor where it's called YOLO, and it's where you can put it in agentic mode and have the software really write itself and talk to itself about writing the software. It's pretty amazing, pretty scary. I think the next step after this is Skynet, pretty much.
It runs terminal commands.
Yeah, it runs terminal commands too. I mean, it's kind of scary. So even between the old card system and this new system where AI is writing the code, there's still this constant, which is that the software has a life cycle. The software of the card system, was you punched out all those holes. Then you made revisions. You replaced some of your cards. You hoped that whatever you changed didn't mean that you replaced a lot of cards. But then you were still managing, here's my V1 was this stack of cards, and then my V2 was this other stack of cards, and my V3 was this stack of cards. Same thing here. We're still making versions here. We've got V1, V2, V3 with our AI. If you've configured it correctly, you're still managing this software development lifecycle. And we can either be intentional about how we do that, or we can just kind of throw caution to the wind, sort of bang away on it until we find, for me, have a little bit of ADHD. I typically will work on a software project until either I find a new shiny thing that grabs my interest, or the client runs out of money. One of the two things, whichever comes first. Sometimes what people will do is they'll write the software, then they'll throw that code over the wall and run away and just kind of cross their fingers and hope that it runs. That's sort of like the antithesis of DevOps. So I'm assuming that everybody is here because they're interested in the process of software development and not just because they couldn't find a seat in Clay's session. Is everybody, you're still here with me? Okay. So I want to look at this idea of DevOps. But before I go into DevOps, I want to talk about the old ways, some of the different things. So some of the questions in terms of, and these are specifically FileMaker questions. When we talk about FileMaker, building locally or on production. Typically other things, we're not really building on the production system, except I don't know if anybody here has heard of a MUD. It was one of these things in the 90s, a multi-user Dungeon and Dragon game. That was sort of my big first coding thing when I got to college, and that was a live development system. So you're in the system playing the game, writing the code to modify the game. It was freaking cool. And I was just like, wow, I didn't even know that was a thing. It was all written in C, which was sort of that's my first love in terms of a software language. I see you twitching there. Yeah, no C, huh? No C. Testing manually or after deployment. When do we test? A lot of times when you just throw the code over the wall, our users are our testers. They're like, okay, tell me if something goes wrong, but don't really, please. And then there's also well, what if you're working in a dev copy? What if you decided, no, I'm not going to do this whole live development thing. That's really risky. So I'm going to do it in a copy. But then what? And I was just telling somebody earlier when I was telling this story of working at Holiday Inn, whenever I had to do an update, the retention policy on all of the reservations, they kept, I think it was about 6 weeks of reservations. And so I would have to manually, between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. ideally, if I wanted to do an update, I'd have to import 380 million records from one system to another system. You're familiar with this, right? You remember that. It was painful. It was painful. So for me, when I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, well, there's actually a meta conversation going on here, which is, how do I actually manage change in my systems? But this isn't all just a FileMaker thing. This happens in other systems. Some of the things are unique to us, like when we're doing live development. Well, that can mess up somebody's system. I don't know if you've ever had your users scream because you're doing some live development, you commit your changes, and then you've got some layout with 16 levels of tabs, and they all go back to the first tab, and they're just what happened? Or even worse is when you get yourself into a lock because you've tried to make a change to the schema, but the user has a record open, and you have to track down that user and say, commit that record so I can commit this change. But that user's gone off to lunch, so bummer. So that's when people start having a meta conversation about this. What do we do to solve all of these problems? The other thing is that as software gets older, it starts to get heavier and bigger and more brittle. Or maybe that's just me, actually. I've been feeling it lately, this aging thing. It's I get injured. We got injured when we were kids. Now it's just I stay injured. That same thing happens with our code. It just gets to become unwieldy. And so we have no idea, what's going on here with our code. So here are some of the approaches. This is not a comprehensive list. There's probably 1,000 different approaches that people have. But I remember when these things were sort of discussed. The default method was waterfall. Everybody's familiar with waterfall. You get your requirements, you start building your code, you test the code, then you deploy the code, and then maybe you start again. And each time, it takes weeks, months, years between starting on the project and it actually getting into the hands of users. And then back in, I want to say, and I'm doing this from memory, I think it was 2000 or 2001, there were 17 separate people who came together and they're like, this is nonsense. And they wrote this thing called the Agile Manifesto. And what that manifesto laid out is, this is how we should do software. We shouldn't be trying to bite off this huge chunk, because by the time it's actually delivered, first of all, it might not have been what they wanted. And second, things on the ground may have changed. It might be too late. You might be locked into something, and then they're like, oh, actually, that thing way back here, turns out we told you that wrong. It's actually this. And then you're just like, well, I guess I have to throw the whole system away and start again. I'll see you in 18 months. And they created the Agile Manifesto, and they're like, no, we got to shorten the cycle. We got to bite off smaller chunks. Oh, it does say 2001 there. Look, I even remember to put that there. And so the smaller chunks allows, you deliver a small piece of it, you get feedback on it and say, hey, does this look good? And they're like, that's kind of close. And then you do it again and you're like, how about now? And they're like, yeah, that's good. And you move on to the next piece. Maybe you've got multiple teams that can work on several things at once, several small little chunks. So that was Agile. And then off of Agile, a bunch of things kind of came. People came up with more formal processes like Lean. So there was this whole movement called Lean manufacturing, which was really about improving costs, reducing the cost of actually manufacturing. And people were like, hey, maybe we can apply that to software development. There's also Scrum, which is a more formalized form of Agile where you have like daily meetings. They're really concerned about timelines. They want to make sure that this project is getting released on time. They want to identify things that might mess up the timeline as early as possible. So you have your daily stand-ups, you have your sprint reviews, making sure that, hey, did you do the thing that you said you're going to do in the amount of time that we said that you can do it? And if not, if it looks like, hey, this is going to take longer, they want to figure that out really early. So those are all kind of good ideas. And then some people were like, there's some more problems here. And they came up with DevOps. And I kind of put a generic thing here because I didn't want to be like, okay, and that's my session. See you later. But it's looking at inefficiencies in the process. Like in the development process, where are we waiting? Where are we kind of spinning our wheels while we're waiting for things to happen? And also with quality, like how do we make sure that we're not just giving users buggy code and then having to firefight that and fix that and then doing it all over again? They get buggy code again, we fix all those bugs, we give them buggy code again. Because one of the things that I think is worse than the users finding a bug is that users lose confidence in the system. Once they've lost confidence in the system, you might as well just stop. Because at that point, they've given up and there's nothing for you to do. They're not going to test your thing. They're not going to talk to you really. They're going to like, oh, okay, I see there's a new release. I'm going to go back to using Excel. So the thing about each of these things is it really is also about sort of team development. Now, sometimes you're a team of one because you have to wear all the hats. But sometimes you have multiple people on your team. Like, I think Eric's on my team. Or are you on the, no, you're on the opposite team? Okay, Eric's on a different team. But Cade's on my team, yes. I can count on Cade. So this is really about teams here. So we're still kind of talking about, like, what's the why of DevOps? So I'm going to go over to sort of the process of what we do with development, So I'm going to develop a feature called Acme Anvil. And, I kind of design, I figure out what am I going to do? What are the things I need? I need an Anvil class with the method drop. And the drop, what it's going to do, it's going to pause for 3 seconds, and then it's going to drop. And it's going to accelerate, and there's going to be a cloud, and then something's going to be splatted at the bottom, probably a coyote. So I've developed this feature. I merge it into the trunk, and then I pray that, 1, it works, and 2, it hasn't broken something else. So maybe I, build the function, blah, 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 and multiple developers. So while I'm working on this, Cade is over here because he's on my team, and he's working on a new feature, which is painted roadway on a rock mountain side. And so he's defined how that's going to work and everything. And then it turns out that when we put our features together, actually my feature kind of messes up his feature. That's the pray part. When we merge it in, we're like, no conflicts, no conflicts, no conflicts. Yes. So how about the FileMaker process? So FileMaker is not a traditional programming stack, as we all know. It's got a unified binary that contains both the code and the data. And there's been traditionally 2 modes of FileMaker development, either live or offline. And live development came with some problems, unless what I did to solve those problems is I had meticulous error trapping. I trapped every single step that could fail. And then people looked at my code and said, what the heck are you doing? And I said, but there could be an error here. And they're like, how in the world could there be an error there? And I'm like, well, what if a user goes in and deletes that layout? I go to layout. I got to check to make sure that layout is still there. Because if I'm going to layout, find all records and delete, and that layout's gone, where am I deleting my records? The layout I was already on. A lot of people, they just turn on error capture and then just like, and that was a way. That was, you could do that. And then that way the users didn't know that there was an error and had no way of stopping you from deleting all of the customers when you really just meant to delete the temp records. So that was one way. Some people were like, if I'm doing this live, maybe I don't want to do that. And in fact, the recommendation, you've probably heard it from people like Wim or even us, we will say, don't do live development. It's risky. There's too many things. You're probably not trapping all of the errors everywhere. Because there are things that can happen. If you've got the schema locked because you're making a schema update and somebody's running a script and it does a thing, that can actually cause an error. And you didn't know that because you didn't think or there's other things where it's like you're doing something and it just, all of a sudden the server's pegged at 99% CPU usage. Not that that's ever happened to me, but so the server's pegged, you're at 99% CPU usage, and now your users are getting errors because the server's not responding to them the way that they expect it to, or they're getting coffee cups or whatever. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong with live development. So one of the ways that we have dealt with this is we'll do it like offline development, right? So instead of opening up the production copy of my file to develop my Acme Anvil feature, I'll make a copy. So I'll have my copy of the file. I'll make changes to the copy of the file. And anybody who's developed it in any other system, like if you're doing boo hiss JavaScript or yay C, you know that once you've made those changes, what you do is you have to do a merge. And how many people have used the merge feature in FileMaker? You're liars. You have not. I mean, there is a sort of
Creates a copy of a database. Doesn't do anything along the lines of what you're describing.
Right. So Claris has been working on the merge feature. I don't know if or when it will be released. That's why you should have gone to Clay's session. You could have found that out. But no, you're stuck here with me. And so now we're all wondering, is there going to be a merge coming or not? But you would make all these changes to the file. And the question is, do we cross our fingers? Do we panic because we forgot to take a backup when we made these changes on production? Or if we've got a copy, are we doing off-hours importing? Which thankfully, since FileMaker 17, we haven't had to do with the data migration tool. But we still have to do it. We still have to deploy that. And then what? That's always been a question. So we've merged in our thing, and next step? I don't know. So the thing that the data migration tool has created, and the thing that I love, and one of the things that, I don't know, did you do Auto FMS? You were on it, right? Oh, that's why you were on the other team and not my team. Okay. So one of the things that we have been advocating with our tool, Auto FMS, is the development staging model. This actually is the formal name for when we talk about using a dev as staging and a prod server. Everybody familiar with those terms and with that model? So development is where the magic happens. That's where I say to Eric, can you build me this cool feature? And Eric's like, no problem. It's going to cost you, though. And it's going to cost, today it costs, I guess, a T-shirt for your wife. So that's fine. And some popcorn, yeah. And so that's where the magic happens. Then we move that over to staging, and that's where we're checking the magician's work. And we periodically deploy the code over there. We do some testing, automated testing, which is kind of cool, which I don't think most FileMaker developers are doing. Maybe they are. Maybe I don't know. I mean, everybody doing automated testing here? Oh yeah, everyone's raising their hands. Yeah, so great. So I don't have to talk about that. And then manual testing to make sure that bugs don't go to users, but also maybe that the software is doing what we think it should be doing. Because you can automated test a lot of stuff, and your software still is wrong. And then there's production. That's where the audience, your users, are amazed. They're like, "Oh, this software's awesome! Great, there's no bugs. It's all been made available to users." So that's the development staging model. And what we do is we just have separate environments for that. We're not testing on the production system. Ideally we're testing during development. We're testing at staging, and then we're pushing it off to production. And all of that was made possible by the developer tool, which I've been a big fan of ever since.
Migration tool.
The migration tool. I mean, there's lots of tools now. It's like the migration tool, there's the, So this is a disadvantage, merging. How do we merge code? I know, right? This is why you should be at Clay's session. Or you could just take a picture of the slide, send it to him, and say, Clay, fix this. But this is not exclusive to FileMaker. I just want to say that. It's an extra challenge in FileMaker because of the binary file format. But just because you can merge doesn't mean that merging is easy. I have been on many projects, not FileMaker, even some JavaScript projects, where we've had to merge, and I go to merge, and it's just all red. It's just a screen just is like scrolling red of all of the conflicts, and I'm just
merged the wrong feature. You're not merging the code.
I merged the wrong feature. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know.
It happens.
It happens. So that's been a problem. Merging. Merging is hard in FileMaker. The other thing is this. I don't know who's ever had this problem. Yeah, but it worked on my system. It was running so beautiful. I even have a video of it running. It was gorgeous. Everything worked. It was responsive. And the user's like, yeah, no, I clicked on the thing and it crashed or it froze or it spun and then did something else and then the coffee machine broke, and it happens. So this is where the DevOps story is. Because we're trying to figure out both of those things. How do we manage the code process, and how do we manage this process? Because this Agile doesn't address this. Scrum doesn't address this. This is but it worked on my system problem. So, but DevOps is this here. Now, it's not a one-time fix. As you can see, this is a loop that just it's just coincidence that our proof logo happens to be, that had nothing to do with that. But I'm going to say retroactive, I'm going to retcon that and say this was entirely what we meant when we came out with this logo, is that it was about DevOps. So the DevOps is a process that feeds into itself. So the life cycle, remember software development life cycle, it follows a structured flow. You start here with planning, you go into coding, you go to building, you test, you release, you deploy, then you operate. A lot of people aren't familiar with that word. And you monitor. And then you see that you go back into planning from monitoring and into coding and building and release. And so it's a loop that you're continuously going through. The intention of this is that you're going to improve reliability. So who is DevOps? Right? Was that our first question? I guess that was our first question. Yeah. Who is DevOps? So DevOps consists of two teams. The developers here, those are the people who are doing the coding. Actually, I think they're all developers, but we'll get to that. So the development team typically has been responsible for the creation of the system. So they code away, and then they say, good enough, and they hand it off. And that's it. They've washed their hands of it. They're like, you've got the code, not my problem anymore. And then they hope it works. I don't know how many people here believe that hope is a viable strategy for success. So next is the operations team. This is the part where a lot of people don't really think about this, at least as developers. But the operators are the ones who are tasked with installing and running the system. They might even provide support to the end users. They might ensure that this environment is sufficient to run the software successfully. There's like, well, this software is using a lot of memory, or this software is using a lot of CPU. We need to get a 24-core Xeon 4.2 gigahertz system with 128 gigs of RAM and an SSD RAID. That's, I've seen it all, and the operators are thinking in that. Developers aren't thinking that. Who knows what they're thinking? They threw the code over the wall. They're done. The other thing that the operators do is they're looking at hey, how's this thing running? Do we have a memory leak? Do we, are we frequently stalling? People are getting coffee cups all the time. And maybe they're catching some errors too and providing feedback to the development team. So I can go to Eric and say, hey, Eric, that thing was great, but actually, this isn't your fault. This is Kyle's fault, I think. Yeah. When I click the right arrow in the field, it should not do anything, but instead it just puts like all these boxes like to infinity. Probably shouldn't do that. And so I could go back to development and say, hey, this is a problem. And then they can like, oh, I've got a plan to fix that. I fix it, come back, and then it goes in the cycle again. So I want to start by looking at not the operator side, but the development side. So on the development side of DevOps, we're focused on improving a couple of things. Well, three things really. Collaboration. That's like the secret sauce of DevOps, is that you're collaborating with the operators. You're not just handing off to the operators. You're part of a cohesive team here with the operators. Automation is the second thing that we're looking at. What parts of the system can be automated? And then also efficiency. How do we reduce the amount of downtime while we're waiting for things to be done? So this begins with version control. We start to track our changes. We actually come up with actual software versions. We can even have multiple developers working on the same project because we've planned this process to do so. So that's the first step. We need to plan what we're doing. How are we going to structure this project? Who's going to be working on it? What is it supposed to be doing? Like, have we gathered all of our requirements? Have we done our design? Have we figured out, like, how are we going to actually deploy this? Are we going to do it in bits and pieces or big chunks or maybe all at once at the end? Who knows? That's part of the plan. That's part of the design of the system. A lot of us, when we started out, we took the standard approach, which was fire, aim, ready. I've certainly done it. Anything that I say, I'm not criticizing you, I'm criticizing old me, because I've done all of these things. At Proof Geist, we use a design-first approach. So everything goes through design. We don't start a project. You don't create the first line of code unless there's a design saying what you're actually doing. And we use a lot of different tools for that, like Miro and mockups for doing some of the visual design. And then we also have like our planning tools. Some of us, most of us, are okay with ClickUp in our company. There are some minorities. I'm not going to mention Martha's name in my session, but there are some unknown people in our company who are virulently anti-ClickUps. But I've also used like things like Trello in the past or Jira as well. They're all good tools for doing that. Jira has this thing called a project roadmap where you can set out, like, here, this is what we're going to do for our project. This is the planning stage. That way you actually kind of know, this is what I'm going to do. Where is it? This is done. This is in progress. This is yet to be started.
ClickUp has that too.
ClickUp has this too. I know. Look, I'm not going to just show our tools and the things that we use. This isn't a ClickUp session, as much as you want it to be. The next step is we start coding. And what I say, me and Martha, who are the design people, we're like, design is easily 50% of it. The code, we can have anybody do it. Even Eric can do the coding. But the design, that requires a lot of thinking and a lot of time to get that right. Then, the next thing that we do is we do a build. This is something that, this is one of the steps that FileMaker people usually haven't done, is taking builds of their systems. There's a lot of ways to do this. We've just developed a system called Auto Projects, or Automatic Projects, yeah. So, yeah.
Under development, it's beta.
It's beta. Automatic Cloud Console Projects, that's even more tongue twister. No. So this is where we're taking builds. We're saying, hey, this is a point where I want to take a checkpoint here and say, this is what I did here. I made this change. I did these modifications. And then I say, okay, there, that's a build.
Package it all up.
Package it all up. I package it all up. And then it goes into testing. And this is where we have all of the fun automated testing tools that you're all doing and using, right? Yeah. Oh, wait a minute. How many people? Everybody was doing automated testing again, right? Yes? Yes, okay. So I won't have to go over that. Please do? Oh, all right, fine.
There is a session on automated testing tomorrow.
There is, and I do have notes. That's Mick, right, from Goya, is doing that. Yes, that's at 10:45 if you're interested. One of the things that I think about automated testing is it requires that you code differently. A lot of times when you were doing some scripting in our systems, we'll just like write a script that does things. You know, I'm going to go to, actually, I have a FileMaker system here. It's a simple file. It doesn't really do anything. It's my event management system. And if I go up here into Script Maker, I'm going to look at one of my scripts. And this script here, add new attendee. This is, you know, a very simple script, but this is kind of what we do. We say, hey, enter browse mode, go to this layout, you know, create a record, and go to field, and then exit script. How do you test this script? What's that?
Well, I'm looking for like a function that returns something, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is essentially an untestable script. So when we're thinking about being able to add automated testing in here, we have to actually switch the way that we program. We have to start thinking about something called in-tier development, which I think Andrew Lucates mentioned this about 5 years ago, and then people kind of glaze it. But in-tier development is where you actually organize your code into different layers. You say, well, this is the UI layer of my code. This is the business logic layer. This is where I'm interacting with the database layer. It doesn't have to be in separate files. A lot of people thought, well, does that mean I need 3 separate files? I need a UI file and a controller file and a data file? No, you can do this all in one file. It's logically, you're thinking in these separate pieces. And the testable portion is really a defined thing where it's like, if I give it this input, I'm expecting this output. And once you create scripts like that, so in this script, I might break this into 2 scripts. One is to go to a layout, and maybe, you know, a lot of people have their favorite techniques. Some people go to a layout with globals. They capture all those globals and everything, and then they package them up into JSON and pass it off to a script that will actually create the record, populate the fields, and then return a result. You can do other ways, but really, when you break it out into those 2 pieces, then you have a piece that's testable. You know that if I give it this JSON, it should give me this result. If you don't do it this way, if you do it this way rather, you can't really test this because we don't have anything that can test going to an attendee layout. What happens if the attendee layout isn't there? How do you test that? Right. I don't know. So it really does require rethinking how you do your scripting here.
Is it valid to do what you used to do when you were coding in production and just say right after that layout thing, just be like, what's, you know, tell me my layout. If it doesn't equal this, throw an error, right?
Sure. Okay, so what it's asking is it valid what I used to do, which is I used to, well, I kind of still do it, but I do it differently now that we have transactions. Is it valid to just, you know, I go to the layout, I test to see if that layout is the layout that I wanted to go to, and then I throw an error? Sure, because if, you know, with my scripts, all of my scripts are exiting with something. Like either the script succeeded and I'm exiting with an error 0, or my script failed and I'm saying why it failed. It failed because you didn't give it the right script parameter. It failed because the layout is missing. It failed because the record was locked. It failed. There's so many different ways that your script can fail. And I've quizzed people. I've shown people steps. I was like, set variable. Can that fail? Yes? No? What are the situations in which set variable fails?
If you're setting it from another variable and the other variable's messed up.
Possibly. If you give it too much, there is a limit to what we can store in a variable. If you overflow the heap, in which case your system's probably crashed anyway and you can't capture that error. But it happens. You dump a whole bunch of stuff into a bunch of variables and now you're out of memory and FileMaker crashes. So almost every single step can fail except for Comet. And so I was testing everything and then I'm returning an error. I used to do this whole thing like, if there was no error, do the thing. Was there an error? If there was no error, do the thing. Check to see if there was an error. And then at the end, return what the error was if there was one. So yes, you can do that and you can test. But you don't really have components at that point. It's less easily testable. And certainly you can't do this, which is, I'm going to go to this layout and just pause there. I'm going to just sit there and let them enter some data in an uncommitted record. That part is not really testable. So what I would do is I would refactor this so they have a testable portion and a non-testable portion. And there's a lot of tools out there that once you start doing automated testing, and just so this is not a vendor session, I'm not just going to talk about AutoFMS and Automatic Cloud Console, as awesome as they are. I'm going to talk about other systems like our friends at, here we go, at Devon. They have, in their deployment system, you can actually run tests. So you create a folder, you call it tests, you put some scripts in there that are all of your tests, and then when you do a deployment in Devon, it will run all of those tests in that folder. And you tell it, like, a completed result is when you do a 1, I think, and then a fail is a 0, or maybe it's the opposite. I don't remember. Do you recall?
1 is completed.
One is pass and 0 is fail. Yeah. And so it'll tell you, like, when you did this deployment, I ran all the tests you told me to run. Some of them failed. And then you're like, okay, let me go back and see what happened there. So automated testing is an important part, and it's really about the developer process at that point. Like, you have to write for testing, and you have to actually write the tests. We don't get those for free in FileMaker. Some systems, like if we're using AI, I know, right? You can get Cursor to actually write the tests for you. Why do we pay you now, actually? I don't know. It's like, you don't do any work anymore, I bet. So going back to the DevOps process, we ended up here. We're at testing. So all of our tests has passed. There's also something called user acceptance testing. And that's typically where operators kind of start to come into the process because they know what the design is supposed to do. And they're like, hey, you built this thing. You built it supposedly the way we told you to build it. Let's see if it's actually working the way that people think it's working. Because one of the things that people have is they have this mental model of how things should work. The mental model, now I want to be fair to users, almost never matches the words that come out of their mouth when they're telling you what to build. So that's why you have user acceptance testing, is to say, hey, I built the thing you said, is that what you wanted? And again, almost every time they're like, I said that? And then you go back into it again. You go back into the design thing. But sometimes they're like, yeah, no, that's pretty cool. That worked. So then we create what's called a release. And this is something that our automatic projects is doing, where we can take any of the builds that we've created, and it's passed all of the tests, everything's looking good, and we say, okay, that one's ready for a release status. And what a release does is it packages it all up, it gives it a version number, and says, hey, you're ready to push this out to one or all of your servers, depending, you might be a vertical and you have 783 clients that you need to push this out to all of those servers, and a release gets pushed out. We don't push out builds. Builds go to like the staging server for testing. We push out releases. And releases are things that have been tested, they have been documented. That's also part of the process. You're building towards something that's been documented. And each of these things, it's improving efficiency. Because while it's in this cycle here, in the release, our developers can still go back coding. In the old method, what would happen is, when you were doing sort of your testing on development, the developers kind of had to stop because they didn't want to introduce new bugs while you're still testing for the ones that they probably created in the last time. So they're like doing nothing while people are testing, and then they're like, okay, green light, and then they make the release, and then you can go back to development. In this process, this thing is going all the time, the development part. The operations part is going all the time, and they're feeding into each other. The developers, once they come up with something like, hey, the stuff I was working on while you were testing, that's ready for testing now. That's potentially going to get released. That's the whole point of the DevOps process, is automating everything that we can automate. That's why it's important. It's going to be more work. I'm not going to lie to you. Writing for testing and writing the tests themselves is more work. But the benefit is you get the automation. And once you get the automation, then it becomes easier. Then you have less work because you're not fixing bugs that you didn't see because it didn't get tested. You're not introducing regressions and then Suddenly you're like, oh, I don't know why your server's slow. Then we hand it over to the operators. Now, this is why I said that operators are also developers. And that's true at our company as well. We don't have any like just operators who can't code, because the operation part is also coding. When we look at the release part of this, they're writing tools that actually help them deploy these releases out to our servers. So like our system, AutoFMS, that was written by our operations team, not our development team. Even though you span both of them, you had your operations hat on at the time. So the release part of this equation is done by the operator. So they're a different type of developer, but they're still a developer. So they can still communicate developerese to the other developers who are writing the code. And so with our OCC projects thing, we can actually create those releases and push them out to as many servers as you want. That's the deployment part. And again, thanks to the migration assistant in FileMaker 17, we can now deploy this in minutes or sometimes hours, depending on how big the system is, rather than days. We don't have to give up our weekends and our nights anymore. We can even schedule all these things to happen. And then we can also roll back. So it could be that we think everything went well, we deploy it, and no, it didn't. We missed something. That's the other part of the deployment process. We can actually roll that back to a previous state and say, hey, nope, we're going to abort this deployment, send it back to development, figure out what happened there. So any tool that you're using, whether it be our tool or somebody else's, you should look for some of these things in it. Can you do an automated deployment? Can you roll back from a deployment? Or are you like scrambling for backups to figure out, oh, if things went sideways, let me go to a backup. The tool should handle that if it's a proper DevOps tool. Then there's the operate portion of this. And depending on the type of project you have, when we're doing our own hosting, when we're doing the development as well, we do the operating thing. We have it running on the servers. We're managing that. We're pushing the deployments off. We're seeing how that's running. We're looking at what's the server capacity, what's the memory like, all of that things. Now, I want to go back to the slide I had before, which said, but it worked on my system. This is a common thing that happens with developers. The developer environment is different than the deployment environment. And that's where in DevOps, you do not do that. You configure your development and your staging and your deployment environments exactly the same. That way the developer is working on the development copy, but it looks exactly like the deployment version. You don't have anything that's different there.
How do you handle like user sessions and the volume of those? That might be different.
Okay, so what he asked is, how do you handle user sessions and volume and things like that? That's going to be part of the testing. There are different tools out there. I believe both Soliant and 2ForU have sort of this, I forget what, one of them calls it like a swarm or something like that. So they will hit the solution with a lot of different clients to sort of do load testing. That's one of the types of testing that you're going to want to do. And there are tools. We don't have any tools that do that, but those vendors do have those tools. So if you do need to test sort of in a load scenario, say, hey, this is working on development with the 3 developers connected here. Is it going to work in production with the 206 users on there? That's where you might need to use one of those types of tools. And the operators are making sure that the environment, everything is configured the way it needs to be. And they're managing, like, what's the development? So if they decide that, hey, the user's environment needs to look like this because this, that's going to make it work better, they're responsible for making sure the staging and the developer environment also matches that. The reason we do that is a lot of times developers will have different libraries on their machine. They'll have different packages. They'll have a different version of a package. They'll have different plugins in FileMaker, and you want to make sure that the environments match as close as they can so that you're eliminating all of these variables that might make it work on Eric's system but not on mine. And then the last part of that is that we need to monitor the system. And that's where we're looking at things that FileMaker server gives us. Like the FileMaker server, I don't know how many people know this, but there was a time when people said, don't turn on top call stats for very long. Like if you have a problem, turn it on and then turn it off. because you're going to trash your server if you just leave it on. That's no longer true. Just leave it on. And top call stats is something that you can use, and it will actually keep monitoring that. For our servers, we're actually collecting all that data and sending it to a data lake so that we can do analysis. Another thing that you can do is application logging. This is really useful. Again, this is more coding that you have to do. But it would be nice if, when I'm looking at top call stats, and it says at 4:32 p.m., this process started really churning. Like I hit 98% CPU, memory was off the charts, other processes were locked up in the queue. What was I doing then? If you have application logging, where you're like logging things that are happening, oh, I'm running this script, let me write to the log and say that. Now we can cross-reference those two logs. We can look at the application log, we can look at the top call stats and say, oh, when this was happening, he had just done this. And then we can figure out where those things are happening.
Is application logging, is that something you can call to that's built into FileMaker, or do you have to make something?
I wish it were built into FileMaker, but it is built into our free AutoFMS tool. The other thing is server monitoring, server health. So we use tools like Zabbix to actually monitor processes and server health and to report proactively back. So if there are any things, we want to, a lot of times the first report we hear is that the server is down. If you're using a tool like Zabbix, you're probably getting some early warning signs and saying, hey, something's wrong. This core is at 98%. You should figure out what's going on there. And then we can say, oh, yeah, it's a memory leak in the WPE engine or the FMSE engine, and I'm just going to restart that service and everything's going to go back and it'll be fine. And then I think, do we just like some servers, I think we just schedule restarting those services because just for health, you know? I mean, you know, right? Yeah, so that's the type of monitoring you're doing. And that's part of the process. And part of that monitoring, you can give that feedback to the developers. You can say, hey, you made that change in your last release. And I'm looking, you know, and the release has a bunch of builds, so there's a lot of changes in there. I'm looking through release notes. You should kind of take a look because that has caused some server problems. We're seeing that the performance has actually declined on that server. So something in that change caused a regression. You're going to want to take a look at that. That's what the monitoring does. It's no longer a silo where you have your operators kind of cursing at the developers and the developers like, I don't know, I didn't do it. Now they're actually working together as a team, which is why DevOps. And I think Wim has a session tomorrow here in this room at 9 a.m. Where he's going to actually cover FileMaker server logging in more detail. So you should definitely go to that one as well. So what DevOps is it's uniting the developer process and the operating process as a shared responsibility. It's no longer different fiefdoms within a company or within an organization. It's no longer an afterthought. It's a continuous automated process of developing, integrating, testing, deploying, and monitoring your code. So rather than throwing the code over the wall, we're actually building together, and everybody is responsible for the proper operation of it. So then the last thing is, where is DevOps? Which I thought was an intriguing question, mostly because that guy was asking it. So DevOps is happening in multiple places. It's happening in your team collaboration. It's happening in your server environment. It's happening in the actual documentation. I mean, we all write documentation too, right? Yeah, of course. It's happening everywhere. So when you are adopting a DevOps process, what you're committing to is actually elevating your software development skills to a higher level, where you're actually professional software developers at this point. You've got documentation, you're writing to that documentation, you're designing the system, you're coding that, you're testing that, you're doing user acceptance testing, you're actually monitoring how it's operating in the field. It's your entire process from end to end. And oh, I thought I had time for a demo, but looks like I'm just about out of time. What's that?
I want to see the demo.
You want to see a demo? I don't know if we have time for a demo. I just wanted to talk about some of the tools that we use and that I mentioned here. So some of the design tools that we've used, like Figma, Miro, mockups. This is where, one of the things that I talk about in terms of design is that you don't want to have lock-in too early. So my favorite design tool is actually a piece of paper and a pencil, because they know that that's not real. Like if you show that to somebody, they don't think, well, it worked like that before. No, it was paper. It did not work. Once you actually like build it, like people, and I've been guilty of this too, we'll prototype it in FileMaker. We'll say, hey, here's the design. What do you think about that? And that creates early lock-in because we're kind of committed to it because we started building it already. That's why we try to use like either analog tools or digital tools like that to do our development. Then there's the project planning. There's all these tools like Asana, ClickUp, Jira, Trello. There's a bunch of them out there. This is really about how are we going to organize this? We got to plan this out. We're not going to just do it all at once. We're going to actually break this up into chunks, figure out how we're going to use this. Now, Eric loves ClickUp. I like Jira for software development. I hate Jira for everything else. Like Jira doesn't manage the actual larger project really well, but it does manage the development part of it pretty well. I think ClickUp manages, well, ClickUp's not opinionated enough for me. So if you're using ClickUp, you have to really have your own opinions and impose those on ClickUp. And then like the build management and deployment. So 360works, they have their own 360 deploy. I mentioned Devon before, they have a deployment tool. We have our own deployment tool, which is AutoFMS and AutoDeploy and Automatic projects. See, I wrote that, I have to correct that on there. But do you see how, if they were just all auto, they would just kind of flow? I don't know.
I didn't name it.
There's other tools and resources. So there's like cloud hosting platforms. If you're using FileMaker Cloud, it's a little bit more difficult. Like it's not impossible, but anybody who's using FileMaker Cloud, you know, it's a little bit of a different process to get new deployments up there. But you can do it. It might be a little bit more manually. But there's 360works Cloud, there's FM Cloud, there's Automatic Cloud. Sliant has their own cloud. There's a lot of people who have cloud servers there. Again, the things that you're looking for, it doesn't matter what the vendor is, what you're looking for are specific features. How can I do deployments? How can I do monitoring? How can I do testing? Those are the things that you want to see. It doesn't matter who the vendor is. You're looking for specific features from that platform. The same thing with testing. Like Devon has testing, FM test, going over that tomorrow, right? Yeah. Inspector Pro. Inspector Pro has this cool feature where you know, you're doing your analysis of the system. You can upload your top call stats into Inspector Pro, and it will flag like the scripts and things that showed up in the top call stats. So you can look and say, oh, it was this layout that was involved. It was this script that was running. So I think that's pretty cool. And then our own FM perception as well. And then for monitoring, some of the tools that we use the FileMaker server top call stats. We use Nagios and we use Zabbix to ensure the health of our systems and our servers. So this list isn't comprehensive. If I didn't mention something, it's not intentional. It's just I can't mention them all. There's a lot of things out there. And really, we're just looking for not a particular vendor, but are the vendors, do their tools provide the types of automation that we're looking for implementing DevOps? So I think that's it. I think we've covered it all. If there's any questions, I know it's, you've got 36 seconds, but, but this is the last session, so I don't have to kick myself out of here. So thank you.